Hello and welcome back to the Walk and Talk, the dog training podcast that helps you understand what's really going on inside your dog's brain and gives you practical, thoughtful strategies to create a calmer, more connected, more joyful life with your four-legged bestie. Now, I'm basically just going to hop straight into today's topic because I'm not going to lie to you. I have accidentally and entirely unintentionally scheduled the loveliest, sunniest, warmest day that we have seen in the UK since God knows when. I don't know, last year probably. For all of this work that I have to get done today, when in reality, I am desperately itching to try and squeeze in at least a brief little outing to the park in the sunshine with the dogs before I have to go and do school run and all of that jazz. So, will it happen? We don't really know yet, but let's just crack on and increase the odds in my favour that it might. Okay, so today's episode is absolutely one that I have been itching to record in the past couple of weeks because I basically recently picked up the amazing Bat Bible, BAT, by the equally amazing Grisha Stewart. You've probably heard of it. If you haven't heard of BAT, it's basically an acronym, BAT, and it stands for Behaviour Adjustment Training. And it's basically the title of a specific methodology or approach that is designed and laid out by Grisha Stewart essentially for reactive dogs. And it's not new. It's not like a brand new thing by any means, although she does update it periodically. I think we're on like BAT 3.0 now. But I've had BAT 2.0 on my bookshelf, pretty much gathering dust, since it was published, which must have been about a decade ago. I feel like I've had it forever. I feel like it's almost as old as my youngest child. And for some reason, and I think with hindsight, it may actually have just been because I just purchased a new set of pastel highlighters and the Bat book is very textbook-esque. Anyway, I got it down, I brought it to my desk, and I thought I'd give it an academic read through again, okay? Spring has sprung, I'm feeling all inspired. I thought, let's dive back into something heavy like this. Test my highlighters, find another way to replace doom scrolling on my phone because I'm doing this. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know I'm doing this desperately trying to reduce your screen time challenge. Try and feel a little bit scholarly. Anyway, for whatever reason, I'm reading this book. So, right at the beginning of the book, she talks about her own dog, Peanut. I think it's fair to say most trainers who really specialize in reactivity do so because they have owned a reactive dog themselves. And Grisha Stewart is, surprise, surprise, no exception. But what really struck me was not just the fact that Peanut was reactive, so he was fearful of other dogs, people, and children, I think, just the usual kind of triggers that we know and we are used to as owners and trainers, but that she describes and openly admits right at the beginning of the book doing years of counter conditioning work with him. And remember, she's a dog trainer, like she knows what she's doing. She's not just your average owner giving it a go. So essentially she's doing all of this treat-based work, rewarding for, looking at the triggers, rewarding for disengagement, all of that, all of the things that we would typically recommend. And yet, despite all of that work, the progress, and don't get me wrong, there was heaps of progress that she describes. I think Peanut was able to compete. I can't remember if it was agility he was doing or like obedience, but obviously he was able to be around dogs. But the progress had a ceiling, basically, because Peanut could cope, but only if she was actively managing him, only if she was really on it, like on the ball in working mode, if you like. She would have to be watching, sometimes feeding, intervening, like guiding every moment of his experience to make sure that he was okay. And the second that dropped, the behavior kind of came back. And I think if we're really honest, a lot of people listening to this because they have a reactive dog will probably recognize that and relate to that feeling of My dog is better. They're much improved. They're loads better, but only if I'm actually micromanaging everything. And so really, there's this underlying fragility to the behavior change. And what Grisha then goes on to explore is a very slightly different approach, which is essentially one that moves away from that constant reinforcement in the presence of triggers and instead focuses on something much deeper, which is basically choice, agency, control, distance, and observation that we don't really get involved with. Letting the dog actually experience the trigger without any interference, without constant feeding, without being pulled away, but at a distance. And I think this bit's really important, where they do feel safe enough to process that experience. And I just sat there thinking, this is actually such an important conversation that we need to have, because this isn't about one method being right and another being wrong. I'm definitely not saying that. I know social media loves to polarize everything and everyone, but that's not what I'm saying. But I think this is about understanding what's actually changing in the dog's brain when we use those two slightly different approaches. So today I thought, why don't we unpack that together? It'll be fun. And I can tell you're all nodding enthusiastically in agreement with me. So on today's episode, we will explore what counter conditioning is really doing, where it shines, where it sometimes falls short, and then contrast that with this bat style approach, this idea of Grisha Stewart's of giving the dog space, giving them agency and the ability to gather information on their own terms without us really getting in the way. And then, most importantly of all, as always, I want to help you understand how to actually move forward with a reactive dog, with your reactive dog, in a way that creates lasting, resilient change, not just behavior that holds together under these perfect conditions that we're forever in charge of. So let's start with counter conditioning, because this is the foundation that most people are working from. At its core, counter conditioning is basically about changing the emotional response to the trigger. Your dog sees another dog, and instead of feeling fear or tension or threat, we pair that experience with something positive, and it's typically food. So, over time, the presence of the trigger predicts something good, and the emotional response of the dog begins to shift. And when this is done well, it can be incredibly powerful, 100%. We see dogs who go from barking and lunging and going absolutely crazy to quietly orienting back to their human, to just softening and just actively seeking out that reinforcement instead of going crazy at the trigger. And neurologically, what we're doing here is we're building new associations. We're essentially saying to the brain, this thing out there that you thought was dangerous actually is a reliable predictor of safety, reward, and just good things. And that's valid. Of course it is. That's definitely useful, 100%. I mean, that's basically, in my opinion, that's an essential starting point for this kind of work with reactivity. But, and this is where I think it gets interesting. And I'm so glad I picked up this book to be reminded. I'm only one chapter in. Uh, that is not the whole picture, is it? Because in many cases, what we're also doing is creating a system where the dog's ability to cope around their triggers is then dependent upon us. So the dog sees the trigger and they immediately look to the handler. Where's my food? What do I do? What's the pattern here? And again, that's not inherently bad. I maintain that that is a monumental and necessary step forward, right? I think we can all agree. But it does mean that the dog isn't necessarily learning how to independently process the trigger themselves. They're learning how to engage in a trained behaviour loop in the presence of the trigger, and that will absolutely get us out of the repetition of the reactive outbursts that make us, want the ground to swallow us up in the moment. But our presence in the scenario and how we act is still critical to the success of the interaction, basically, isn't it? And so you can kind of see how successfully independently processing something and then deciding that you're cool with it, or just defaulting to a rewarding trained behavior loop, are actually two slightly different things. One is, I feel safe around this now, whilst the other is, I know what to do when this appears, as long as my human is guiding me and does what I need them to do. And that distinction really matters when things aren't perfect, because that's where we often see our little slip ups and setbacks, right? Those moments when you're just caught off guard and you don't have your food ready, or you're distracted by something, or the trigger just appears really suddenly, or your timing is just a little bit off. If the system that gives us success relies on constant reinforcement and guidance, it stands to reason that there's always a risk that it can fall apart under pressure. And that's exactly what I think Grisha Stewart was describing with Peanut. So let's then contrast that with the BAT approach. And if you know nothing about it, buckle up. We're going to learn what it is now. So, at its core, BAT is not about adding something to the situation, like food or a toy or whatever the reward strategy is. It's mainly about removing pressure. It's about creating a situation where the dog is at a distance from the trigger, where they are absolutely under threshold. And that doesn't mean that, they are just barely coping, but they are genuinely able to observe calmly. And then allowing them to look, to orient, to gather information without immediately interrupting that process in any way. And this is where I think it becomes really fascinating from a behavioral and neurological perspective, because what the dog is doing in that moment is not just reacting, but they are processing. They are engaging with the environment in a way that allows their brain to update its understanding of the trigger and what it means. They see the other dog and nothing bad happens. They look at it and they are not forced to go any closer. They're not trapped, they're not overwhelmed. And crucially, they have the option to disengage if they want to. And that disengagement, that choice to look away, to move off, to self regulate, that is what gets reinforced. But we don't reinforce it with food necessarily, but with functional reward. So the distance between your dog and the trigger dog increases. That is functionally rewarding to your dog. The pressure of the situation decreases. That is functionally rewarding to your dog. The fact that safety is maintained, nothing bad happened, we had a positive experience. That is a functional reward. And I think the reason this is so powerful is because it taps into something really important, which is basically the concept of control, agency. One of the biggest drivers of fear and reactivity is a lack of control. When a dog feels trapped or forced or unable to escape, their nervous system just escalates. But when they feel they have agency, that they can move away, that they can choose not to engage, that alone can dramatically reduce the intensity of the emotional response. So, in BAT, we're not just changing associations, we're changing the dog's relationship with the trigger. We are teaching them you are safe, you do have options, you can handle this. Now, I appreciate that at this point, it probably sounds a bit like I'm saying BAT is better than counter conditioning. And I want to be really clear. That is not what I'm saying, because I think both approaches have strengths and I think both have limitations. Personally, I kind of think a careful combination of both is the ideal. Counter conditioning is brilliant, absolutely brilliant for creating positive emotional shifts, especially in dogs who are highly food motivated or who just need help breaking out of a very negative association pattern. It's also incredibly practical, right, for everyday owners because it gives you something concrete to do. And that matters. I actually think that matters psychologically for the dog owners a lot. Everybody always wants an action. They want a task, they want a method to solve a problem, something they can proactively do. But where it can fall short is in the longer term in building that independence and resilience that exists just in the dog alone. Whereas I think Bat, on the other hand, actually excels at that part. It builds dogs who can think, who can process, who can make good decisions without that constant input. Uh, the downside is it can definitely be harder to implement because it requires sometimes a really significant amount of space. So you would need a well controlled setup because also you wouldn't want another dog to come in from behind or whatever that you didn't notice and ruin all of that positive learning. So essentially, you need to be working in a space that you have 100% control over. You need to know that the dog in the distance isn't going to get any closer. So you probably need to know that owner and that dog as well and have the whole thing set up. Everything needs to be well timed. And you need to have a really good understanding of thresholds and the indicators of where a dog is, how close they are to that threshold, whether they're over it, whether they're at it, whether they are truly calm or not. And also, it doesn't always give that like immediate win that feeding, having a successful disengagement, and walking away can provide to an owner. So, there are definitely pros and cons to both. So, with that said, then, where do I think this leaves us? Because if you are listening to this, probably with a reactive dog of your own, I guess you're thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but what should I do then? How do I translate this to something that's going to work with my dog? And this is where I want to offer you a more integrated perspective because in reality, like I said, the most effective training plans are not rigidly one thing or the other. They are sort of like a bespoke recipe, like your nan's recipe that's handwritten, a pinch of this, an extra scoop of that, that kind of thing. Because a decent trainer will take into account the individual dog in front of you. Maybe they've got some quirks, and so you'll throw in a few adjustments accordingly. Now, there are without doubt moments where counter conditioning is exactly what's needed. Moments where you need to quickly shift the emotional state, create safety, and build those positive associations. But I think there are moments where stepping back and creating distance and allowing the dog to simply observe is actually probably far more powerful. And I think one of the biggest mindset shifts here, if you take just one thing away from this episode, is moving away from the idea that we always need to be doing something, that every second around a trigger needs to be filled with instruction or food or intervention of whatever kind. Because sometimes the most impactful thing you can do is just less. Do less. If your dog is aware, but they are totally under threshold because the distance has allowed for that, then just do less. Creating the right environment and then letting the dog's brain do what it's designed to do, letting your dog independently process and learn and adapt their own response, I think is really, really powerful. And when we're working with reactive dogs, I think it's very easy to just become focused on stopping the reaction, stopping the barking, stopping the lunging, managing out that behavior. But behavior is really just the surface. Underneath that is a nervous system that is just trying to keep the dog safe. And if we only ever address the surface issues through control and management, constant reinforcement, constant intervention, we can absolutely improve things. Absolutely, we can. But we may not fully resolve them. Whereas when we start to work with the nervous system, when we give the dog enough space and enough control and the ability to process what's going on, that's when I think we start to see deeper, much more lasting change. Change that is far more likely to hold up, even when you are not perfect, even when life happens in a way you hadn't quite anticipated, even when, God forbid, you don't have a treat ready in your hand. So, if this episode has got you thinking, which I hope it has, that was definitely the intention, then I do think that's a good thing. But do remember not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because I don't think the goal is to abandon what you've been doing already, but just to refine it ever so slightly. So maybe next time you are an entire football pitch away from another dog and your dog is actually able to calmly notice it, you will just let them watch it for a while without intervening and see how it goes. And if you are genuinely currently stuck with a reactive dog and you think the idea of them calmly watching another dog from any kind of distance is absolutely the stuff of fantasy, I have a reactivity rehab training program designed specifically to help owners like you that you will find on my website, which is listendogtraining.com. If you would rather, alternatively to that learn at home course, if you would rather have some more active monthly support with oodles of weekly training tutorials, feedback, Q&As, all of the good stuff, then you can check out my online dog training club, which is a monthly membership. It costs less than £20 a month and it gives you a dog trainer in your back pocket, basically. I don't know who doesn't love the idea of that, personally. If you do, I will leave the details in the show notes. You can also come and find me on the gram, as always. I'm at Listen Dog Training. If you want to learn any more about me or my dogs or the kind of training that I do. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. You will be pleased to know, I'm sure you've been dying to know, that the sun is still very much shining. So I think we're going to make it outside, guys. And I will be back same time next week for another episode of The Walk and Talk.